It is about that time. It's time for Indaba right here on Talk City 91.1 FM, where knowledge grows. Some incredible discussions that you do not want to miss. Trinidad and Tobago, get ready. This is Indaba.
Aquaba, greetings. Welcome to yet another edition of Indaba, the voice of the national, of course, reparations movement in Trinidad and Tobago. I say that, of course, tongue in cheek because we are today graced with the opportunity to be the, as it were, conduit through which both Ambassador David Commission of out of Barbados, as it were, ambassador to CARICOM, and of course Dr. Chenzira, of course, Davis Kahina, representative of CPAN. They are joining us live on tonight to talk about the very historic reparations conference coming out of Ghana. Ghana was alit with reparatory justice from the 14th of November to the 17th of November. And here live on tonight, myself and my very distinguished colleague, this reparations phenom, this activist extraordinaire in Shabaka Kambon, we have the opportunity tonight to interview these living legends as they talk about the outcomes of this very historic conference dealing with, again, African reparations. But before we go live into our feature discussion, it is very important for us to cue you into the very next upcoming topic, which is that of the Kwanzaa market, the Emancipation Support Committee's Kwanzaa market. So it's end of year time. You want to know where to shop so that you can find these lovely African threads that are being donned by my brother and I on tonight. Well, certainly the Emancipation Support Committee's Kwanzaa market is just the place to go. So with that said, over to you, Renee, as you take us into the video clip featuring, of course, the ESC Kwanzaa market.
Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago invites you to the 2023 ESCTT Kwanzaa Market at the Queen's Park Savannah on Friday 1st to 3rd December from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Come enjoy music, food and drinks, samples while you shop for local delicacies, home decor, skincare items, clothing, jewelry, and unique gift items. If you missed shopping at the Emancipation Village this year, here is your chance to get those special niche products. Come to the Kwanzaa Market Friday 1st to 3rd December. For more information, call 292-7288 or 235-5008.
And there you have it. I will turn it over to you, my very distinguished colleague, to again introduce and present to some our very distinguished guests as we go into tonight's featured discussion.
Okay, so we are delighted indeed to have our dear colleagues from the region here with us. No other than the chair of the Caribbean Pan African Network and ambassador to CARICOM from Barbados, who attended this historic AU conference on reparations. Representing both Barbados and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And of course, from within CPAN itself, we had our dear friend, Dr. Chenzira, who is no stranger as well to Indaba. So with that said, let me let me bring in our guests to give us a sense of what made this, what was so important, why is this conference something that our people should pay attention to and should know about? What was it that was so special about this particular event? Dr. Commission, perhaps you'd like to start?
Yes, thank you very much, Shabaka. Thank you very much, Brother Kwame, for those very kind words. This conference was put on by the government of Ghana in collaboration with the African Union. And they put on this conference in the 10th year of the CARICOM reparations campaign, which was started in 2013. And approximately maybe 2.5 years ago, CARICOM decided that the next phase in our reparations campaign, which we had started in 2013, was to reach out to Africa and to invite Africa to come on board with us. Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley, who is the chair of the CARICOM Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, therefore wrote to the African Union, to the chairman of the African Union, and asked that the message be spread to all of the member states, explaining to the African Union about the CARICOM reparations campaign and formally and officially inviting them to come on board and partner with us. Fast forward then to February of this year at the African Union Heads of Government Summit in Addis Ababa. Ghana places a resolution on the agenda asking the African Union to commit not just to pursuing reparations, but also to partnering with CARICOM. That resolution is passed in February. Go now to July, a few months later, July of this year, the African Union sends a study tour to the Caribbean, specifically to the island of Barbados, to sit with us, to learn from us. They said they wanted to learn, what lessons we could share with them about our reparations journey so far as they prepared themselves for Africa to come fully on board. And we brought in to Barbados members of CPAN, members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, members of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And we had, for 1 week, we had this wonderful grounding with our brothers and sisters. And so this conference now is a follow-up to those events, the passing of the resolution in February, the study tour in July, and now this conference. And this conference is propelling the creation of a full-fledged African strategy on reparations, which will be presented to their heads of government at their summit in February of 2024 for them to sign off on the fully worked out strategy. So hence the importance of this gathering in Ghana, which was fully supported by CARICOM. I mean, the CARICOM Secretariat was there. The CARICOM Reparations Commission was there.
I understand that the Secretary General also gave a presentation. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Secretary General delivered an opening address at the beginning of the conference. Of course, Prime Minister Motley gave one of the keynote addresses. And CARICOM was very, very well represented because the conference was all about two things. It was about, one, Africa further developing its reparations strategy. And secondly, it was about Africa confirming its partnership with CARICOM and beyond CARICOM, the wider diaspora, but primarily CARICOM in pursuing reparations. So I think that gives you a good picture of what this conference was all about and why it was so historically significant.
Yeah. Okay, Brother David, before I let you off the hot seat, I need to make it clear to our listeners that Africa did not just start pursuing reparations, though. We've had initiatives coming out of the continent that predate the CARICOM initiative.
Yeah, the Organization of African Unity um, had initiatives on reparations way back at the beginning of the decade of the 1990s. And in fact, they had in Abuja, Nigeria, in 1993, a very important, the first Pan-African conference on reparations. And out of that came the Abuja Proclamation, and they also established the group of eminent persons, the OAU's group of eminent persons on reparations. And behind that, the driving force behind that was Chief Moshood Abiola of Nigeria and our own Ambassador Dudley Thompson of Jamaica. So, and that initiative actually inspired many of us in the Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora. However, that initiative faltered, and in fact, when the OAU was in a sense decommissioned to make way for the new African Union, the new African Union did not replicate the reparations initiatives of the OAU. You know, but which is not to say that Africa still did not take an interest in reparations, because Africa was very much involved in the UN World Conference against racism. But it is still true to say that in this recent phase of the reparations movement, it really has been CARICOM that has been, in a sense, doing the running, and there have been and CPAN is a very unique institution because CPAN was established to be involved in a working relationship with the African Union. And it is through that working relationship with the African Union that critical officials of the AU, very interested in reparations, connected to the CARICOM reparations movement through CPAN, in a sense, kind of plotted the strategy to pull the AU fully back into the mainstream of reparations, and so we are now seeing the fruit of that work, the fruit of AU officials who were rubbing shoulders with CPAN and who were determined that Africa must come back fully into the fold, and at the same time, CARICOM actually reaching out to Africa and saying, hey, we have now reached a phase in our campaign where we recognize that the next phase has to be in partnership with you, Africa. Yes, so yeah. I think that gives you the full picture.
Yes, Ambassador, let me say that it is indeed a pleasure for all of us who belong to this region to see the central place that our leadership is playing in the discourse on reparations globally. So it's good today that you're talking about the continent, but certainly we've also inspired our brothers and sisters in North America, in Central America, and in South America as well with the work that we've been doing. I want to bring in Dr. Chenzira. Dr. Chenzira, it is my understanding that when the Africans on the continent talk reparations, they're not just talking about the period of enslavement, but they also have certain key issues related to things that happened on the continent that they would have added to the conversation. I don't know if you were part of any of those sessions.
You're muted.
Sister, you're muted. We're not hearing you yet. While you're muted, let me say good night to Natasha in studio. Special good night to our colleague in 91.1 and our listeners on that side. Dr. Chenzira? Oh, we're still not hearing Dr. Chenzira. If you're just joining us, folks, this is Indaba, the place where knowledge grows, the place to find consensus, the voice of the people, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee. And we're here with our guest, Caribbean. We're talking about the African Union Reparations Conference, which just ended. Yes, Dr. Chenzira, I think we're hearing you now.
I'm sure you're probably hearing everything else in my surroundings as well. Right. Greetings, Hotep, everyone. I want to go straight to the response to what you've asked. So I was one of those persons when I go to conferences, I like to go to every single session possible.
That makes two of us.
Every Right, right. I like to have all of the side conversation, all of the engagements with persons inside of the post session activities. So yes, there's a number of issues that were raised, but I wanted to really touch back on a couple of things that were highlighted as well. Before I even go to that, it was a very holistic approach to how the heads of state, the respective agencies inside of the African Union, inside of the UN's Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, inside of CARICOM, inside of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and the connection that the Caribbean Pan African Network, CPAN, has with all of those entities. And it was also another thread that was linked to what transpired at the conference, at the study tour in Barbados in July, which is the African Jurist Organization, because their focus is very legal and their focus is very much so tied to how are we going to address, like, not just low hanging fruit but the long term challenges in regard to dealing with international concerns of reparatory justice tied to the enslavement, the triangular enslavement industry piece. Yes, but then looking at certain things that are happening, like no, no, no. So to answer your question, there were various conversations that were raised from the civil society as well as from government representatives regarding how do we prioritize the transatlantic enslavement industry portion of the reparatory justice piece and not look at what's happening like right now with child human sex trafficking. These were things that came up from the floor, and these were issues that were also raised in regard to how do we
Dr.
incorporate.
Chinziro, what I was specifically considering was with things like the return of artifacts, the returns
Absolutely.
of human remains from the colonial period.
Hmm.
We know that some European countries tend to like to keep the heads of the Africans that they conquered in the hundreds for whatever reason, and or other body parts. These kinds of things too seem to be part and parcel of the discourse on reparatory justice. Uh, you
Right,
know, uh,
right.
not in a contemporary but a historical, related to the whole colonial experience. So as part of that colonial experience, and I was wondering to what extent you were part of those kinds of conversations.
There were a number of comments and concerns raised about repatriation of artifacts. And usually the main entity that was highlighted, at least in most of these sessions, it was between requests from the Herero people in Namibia. It was
Right,
requests from parts of persons from that,
and they,
like,
they are also seeking reparations for genocide. The
exactly.
Herero and the people.
And there was a
Yes.
presentation that was shared by one of their representatives of their human rights organization as well. And I want to speak specifically to what our own representative, Dr. Hillary Brown of the CARICOM Secretariat, shared specific to the Pocomo people who have a specific quest to have their ancestral drum returned that was stolen by the British Empire, and it remains inside of the British Museum's archives. And so there's an actual
And
recommendation.
these Kokomo people are from where?
That's Kenya.
From Kenya. Okay,
Yeah.
let me bring us back to the Caribbean here for a second. I just read
Okay.
that the remains of some of our leaders who fought during that period of the Haitian Revolution in Grenada and other countries in the Eastern Caribbean are in museums in the UK. And I also found out that there is a some of the artifacts that were taken when Abercrombie, who we have a street named after in Trinidad, when he came to the Caribbean, with Picton to put down revolts and eventually to go to Haiti. When which of course the Haitians had already won by the time he got there, but he went to Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, and there he invaded the territory. He broke the treaty between the British and what we call the Black Caribs or the Garifuna people, and killed Chatouillet and took some of his things back to the UK. And those things are there as well. These are things we should be asking for, no?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's actually the easy part of reparations, because that is already contained in the Durban Program of Action. So that is already, in a sense, part of the international law. And so that's the easy part. Of course, these artifacts don't belong to these European nations, stolen. And like all stolen property, they should be returned to their owners, you know. And the Durban Program of Action confirms that.
Yeah, let me just, there's coming from our listeners, there's a question here which will take us off topic slightly, but it is important. It's a question about reparations that are due to the Rastafarian community for the injustices and oppression that they suffered both during the colonial period and afterwards in the period of independence. Specifically, of course, we'll be talking about the case in Jamaica. Anybody want to address that question? It's coming from one of our listeners.
The government of Jamaica has already addressed that. The government of Jamaica has already apologized to the Rastafarian community and has made some effort at compensation or reparation. I think those efforts were directed at elderly members of the Rastafarian community who would have been most materially in need. So the question would be not whether in principle it has been agreed, because it has been agreed in principle, but whether enough has been done. But when we speak about reparations for native genocide and African enslavement, we are grounding our claim in international law, and we are grounding our claim in the commission of crimes against humanity and genocide. And so, you know, if we want to use the prism of reparations to address past injustices, I think we need to look to see whether the injustices rise to the level of crimes against humanity or genocide, because, you know, history is replete with injustices. They're all, you know, human life is replete with injustices, but it is not every injustice that is going to attract reparations grounded in international law. So that would be my only caveat. But yes, I mean, there were countries like Dominica, you know, where Rastafarians were hunted. I mean, Rastafarians were hunted, people were shot and killed. So of course, you know, there is a case for repair, not necessarily in every Caribbean country, but in countries where the oppression was really gross, such as Dominica and such as Jamaica in certain instances as well.
Yes. So I think we would have lost our audience on 91.1 because they would have broken for the lotto, the lotto draw. They will rejoin us in a few minutes. In that time, though, we could continue with our audience on YouTube and, of course, on the Emancipation Support Committee Facebook page. Brother David, I can't imagine that there would have been a conference taking place at this time anywhere in the world with progressives who did not mention where Palestine was not mentioned. You know, correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm trying to think. Unlike Dr. Chen, I did not attend every session of the conference because I had some other work to do. So I had some other meetings.
Yeah. So, Dr. Chen, did you hear that? Did you hear calls for free Palestine? Oh boy, we muted again, doctor. Oh boy.
Nice to say, Shabaka, if it was mentioned,
Can you
it
hear me
was
now?
it was stressed upon. I think the focus of the conference was very much on reparations for African enslavement and for
Yeah.
justices, the African Indians, and the African people. But of course, the whole of the global South, um, is in the cause of the Palestinians. In fact, I spent a week in London before going to the Accra Reparations Conference. I was in that march, a tremendous march of perhaps no less than 500,000 people through the streets of London. So I think that what is happening in Gaza has really put vision in the world. The global South is witnessing immense injustice, is witnessing this televised genocide, and cannot understand the level of depravity, not only of the people committing the genocide, but the nations and governments that are supporting them. So I think it would have been. I don't even think you needed to physically express it. That entire gathering was in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, as is the entire global South.
I want to
Indeed.
add to what Ambassador Kamisian shared. So there were several representatives from the AU that did speak in detail regarding what transpired, what is transpiring because it's not finished, what has happened leading up to that from 1948 to present, um, and the fact that that form of genocidal terrorism needs to cease and that everyone needs to intervene. And this was coming from several different representatives from the AU. And even in the culminating activity on the final day, there was a very clear comment made on that while we're here in a reparations committee, that we really need to make sure that we don't allow for these types of activities to continue, these types of wars, these types of genocidal acts of terrorism, and not say anything. So there was a call for action from not only African nations, not only from the Caribbean, the Americas, but even from quote unquote the Arab world, to make sure that there wasn't this continuum of this type of violence that we're experiencing, that we're seeing live and direct.
We're actually trying to seek reparations from just that type of violence right now. And certainly we wouldn't want to see it repeated. So now, Dr. Commission, Dr. Chenziro, what I'm looking for now is for us to help our listeners to understand, this reparations movement. Those people who are just coming in, I mean, the loyal listeners of Indaba would have heard a lot about reparations on this program. We try to return to this subject as often as we can. We see ourselves as a vehicle for informing, bringing our people who have been so brutalized by our history as to not even understand the importance of compensation for that brutality into the conversation. People who go to school and don't get anything about reparations in their curriculum. We use this program as a space to bring them into the conversation so that they can be part of the process. And so, Dr. Ambassador Commission, you've already indicated that this was an important historic step forward in the program where Africa came on board, and they're looking forward. Now we're looking forward to the next session of the African Union in February, where some concrete decisions, where the decisions that were already articulated could be made concrete at the highest level. But take us beyond that now and tell us what we might expect now with a world, a former colonial powers now facing the collective might of the continent and its diaspora.
Well, first of all, permit me to say that during my presentation to the conference, I laid out in detail the damage that was done to the continent of Africa itself by the European orchestrated trafficking in enslaved Africans and by the system of racialized chattel slavery. Because we are all familiar with the oppression and injustice that our ancestors faced here in the New World, in the Caribbean and in the slave colonies of the Americas and so forth. We Caribbean people are very familiar with that and understand that crimes were committed against our ancestors, that our ancestors worked for generations, never got to keep or to enjoy the fruits of their labor. And so it is easy for us to understand that we were wronged and we are due compensation. However, there may not be the same appreciation of the damage that was done to the continent of Africa itself. So I spent some considerable time outlining the damage that was done to Africa, the loss of population. I mean, we are talking maybe a minimum of close to 30 million people in an overall African population that probably would have been maybe just over 100 million. We're talking about European diseases decimating African kingdoms. We are talking about kingdoms being destroyed. Africa's whole developmental trajectory being disrupted, and so when Africa gets on board, Africa is recognizing the crimes that were committed against the continent itself, the damage that was done to the continent itself, and that they too have a case for reparation. So as we go forward, there's several things we are going to do.
Commission, before we move forward into that, let me just introduce you to a question now again from one of our listeners. And one of our listeners, and this was raised in Trinidad and Tobago earlier in the year when we had the visit of the king of the Ashanti people to Trinidad. The role that particular kingdom played in the trade aspect of enslavement, and so one of our listeners here is, and this would be, of course, the way that we are being taught in the Caribbean, or the way we've historically been taught from the colonial period, is to see part of the responsibility for our enslavement, to put part of that responsibility on the shoulders of our brothers and sisters from the continent. I would just like, for the benefit of our listener, we've done it many times here on Indaba. I'm sure myself and Brother Kwame Kamau could easily answer the question, but since we have you and Dr. Chinzira here, maybe you could help them to understand that question, the question of placing responsibility and blame for the period of the enslavement of our ancestors on our brothers and sisters from the continent.
Well, first of all, the history is very complicated. Yes, the Ashanti Kingdom did collaborate, but what was the ultimate fate of the Ashanti Kingdom? The ultimate fate of the Ashanti Kingdom was that the same European powers targeted them, attacked them twice, raided Kumasi, destroyed the Ashanti Kingdom, and made the Ashanti Kingdom into a protectorate of Britain. So, look, we have to understand that the system of the trafficking and enslaved Africans was conceptualized by Europeans, was planned by Europeans, was orchestrated by Europeans, was financed by Europeans, and it was ultimately to Europe's benefit. When the Europeans first went into Africa with this notion of extracting slaves, they went in with violence, with terror, warfare, destroying African towns and villages, brutally killing people, capturing people, enslaving people. And from those beginnings, Then they elaborated a complex process of extracting enslaved Africans from outright kidnapping to setting up slave castles to putting merchant middlemen in place in Africa to exacting tributes. So, for example, the Europeans, with their superior armaments, might say to an African kingdom, you are obligated to provide us with 1,000 enslaved bodies a year. If you fail to do that, we will attack you. We will conquer you. We will enslave you as well. So there are multiple cases where um, African polities were actually forced into some form of collaboration because of the threat. Either you become complicit or you become the victim. You will be targeted, and so we need to understand all the nuances and complexities. But even if you can identify African polities that collaborated not because they were under duress, but that they felt that there was some profit for them in it. And if there's such a case, you might say the Ashanti would be the ones who come closest to that case. But ultimately, what was their fate? They too were ultimately set upon by the.
I think the point you were making at the beginning there, Doctor, if somebody is responsible for orchestrating, organizing, planning, setting up a particular crime, you can't place that person on the same level of somebody who then ends up in some form of collaboration with that crime. If somebody has organized, orchestrated, set up, financed, and benefited from a crime, the level of the person who has collaborated cannot be the same. It's like in the Nazi Holocaust.
I think that goes without saying. I don't think we need to argue that. That goes without saying. But I'm saying, even if you can find instances where the African polities that collaborated because they reckoned that there was, not that they were under duress, that they reckoned that there was a material benefit in it for them, they too ultimately became victims of the Europeans. They did not derive, ultimately they did not derive any material benefit.
Yeah. And just to make your point, when the Ashanti king came here, he would have met one of his nieces here, who, because when they destroyed and defeated the Ashanti kingdom, they actually brought the king. They took the king to some island in the Pacific, maybe, before bringing him to Trinidad with his family. And his daughter grew up here, and she met the new Asante Hene for the first time right here in front of our eyes at the Hilton Hotel. So it was very interesting familial reunion took place right here in Trinidad due to British conquest. So that's another interesting side story related to what you're saying there.
I just want to add though that because I agree with everything that's being shared. However, even those that were involved in the collaboration process, chattel enslavement, very different than I go to war with you and the prisoners of war are given to as tributes to your kingdom so that the enemy doesn't stay in my kingdom. Chattel enslavement was very different. It was not, there was no opportunity for any form of humanization in any kind of relationship. And I think that's
I'm gonna leave that there because I think we've answered.
No, but there's a further point. There's a point that the continent of Africa as a whole, because of those 400-500 years of European orchestrated enslavement and trafficking in enslaved African bodies, the continent of Africa was brought low. Tremendous damage, physical damage, material damage was done to the African continent. damage that it up to today it has not recovered from. And so when we talk about reparations, what we are saying, look, the Europeans will never be able to compensate for all of the crimes, the 500 years of enslavement and mutilations and executions and whippings and brandings and all of the multiple crimes. So they will always owe us a moral debt. There will always be a moral debt. But when we talk about reparations, we are saying that reparations must address the historical legacies of underdevelopment that are directly linked to these crimes of native genocide and African enslavement. So we are saying you look at the continent of Africa today, you look at the Caribbean societies today, there is structural underdevelopment that can be traced right back to the crimes that were inflicted upon these areas, these societies, and our people by these European criminals over a period of hundreds of years. And that is what we are seeking to redress, the legacies of underdevelopment that still exist up to today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Indeed. So, Dr. Commission, back to you. You were talking about now the things that we should expect to see going forward.
Yes. Well, first of all, Africa is putting its house in order. So, at this conference, they confirmed that they will be establishing their own group of experts on reparations that will help to guide their campaign and their strategy. They're also establishing a fund, a reparations fund that will be used to fund reparations activists and reparations organizations on the continent of Africa. We in CARICOM are doing a similar thing. We have mandated that all of our governments must provide for the national reparations commissions in the national budget. But beyond that, we are also in the process of bringing in other sources of funding to help upgrade the activities of the various reparations bodies. We also have agreed in principle that we will establish a joint African Union CARICOM legal committee. We will bring together the legal experts to explore all of the possible legal strategies in pursuing reparations. So whether we are talking national litigation, whether we are talking the International Court of Justice, whether we are talking strategies through the various treaty bodies of the United Nations, whether the Human Rights Council or the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, all of that will be addressed. We have also decided, both CARICOM and the AU, that we will be upping the ante at the United Nations. We will be seeking to pilot a major reparations resolution at the UN General Assembly, not only confirming that reparations are due to us, but perhaps also mandating the establishment of a special international tribunal to adjudicate our reparations claim, because there is an understanding that really and truly no existing court is really very well equipped to deal with a claim of this magnitude and complexity, and therefore we may have to go the route of setting up a special tribunal. So you know, those are so the whole idea is that Africa will be coming fully on board. Africa will be mapping out its own strategy through the committee of experts, but African and CARICOM will also be working together in terms of the Joint Legal Committee, in terms of action at the United Nations, etc. And we hope and we believe that come 2024, We are going to have an African Union CARICOM conference at the level of the heads of government. I mean, this was agreed upon back in September 2021 that we would have annual African Union CARICOM conferences. And the feeling of the CARICOM leadership is that the next conference in 2024 should be dedicated primarily, if not exclusively, to the issue of reparations. And out of such a conference should come a joint African Union CARICOM mechanism for taking forward the struggle. There's also an understanding that Africa and the Caribbean are likely to be in the vanguard of this global reparations movement, simply because we are the ones that possess, sovereign and independent countries. We are the ones that possess national governments. We have seats at the United Nations. We have embassies, etc. Our brothers and sisters who are minorities in white majority societies are not so fortunate. However, we are urging our brothers and sisters who live in these white majority societies to establish their own national reparations commissions, just as the African American population in 2014, with some assistance from CARICOM or some inspiration from CARICOM, established the African American National Reparations Commission. I was in the UK urging our brothers and sisters in the UK to do likewise, to establish their own national commission, because we need to reach to the stage where all of these national entities, these national reparations commissions, can sit at the same table and discuss and plot the way forward for our global reparations movement. We now have a global movement.
Yeah, and I think, David, I think one of the most beautiful things about living in this time is the degree to which the moral consensus around the world has shifted now in support of our movement. This is something, I mean, as somebody who grew up around the reparation struggle, it is who didn't believe, we didn't believe when we were growing up and we were talking reparations that we would see anything of this kind in our lifetime. To see the moral consensus in the world shift to agree with us that we are due compensation for the injustices, reparatory justice is something phenomenal. Dr. Chenzira, let me bring you in here to give us some sense of what was your most profound takeaways from being at this historic event. And we've heard David give us a broad, sweeping sense of what we could expect coming forward at the official level. Tell us what was your takeaway, that something that we could hold on to here?
There were several elements, so I want to just give the quick list. The panel that I presented on focused on youth and women. And it was very interesting that in what was shared through a lens of CPAN and through a lens of the work that I do through a host of other civil society networks, non-governmental organizations, and as a so-called academic, that we really focused on the importance of public awareness and public education around reparations and being able to utilize media and technology and digital communications to really make it so that it is available more readily for young people, not so young people, elders, persons that are not familiar with anything having to do with anything around reparatory justice. So that was one of the things. It was also important and shared in a number of the panels around the importance of system change, and that use Eurocentric processes and methodologies that address this African situation, these African realities around reparatory justice. So there was this balancing around that particular portion. It was also a highlight on holistic approaches, so that yes, there's going to be a legal framework that's utilized. There's just going to be a political framework that's utilized from the heads of state and the respective representatives, but there also needs to be an economic driver to be able to finance and fund and have developments that are supporting reparatory justice in the context of economic upliftment and the restoration of equity, especially for people of African ancestry. And then there was a very important point made and it was very visible. Almost every panel in between, either in the beginning, in the middle, as well as the end, had some type of creative art presentation. So whether it was Nana Asase, the poet, who was giving us a narrative as a griot and sharing the history and the legacy, whether it was the performing arts performers from the so the school performing arts production that was sharing what took place, how enriched we were in our respective traditional institutions and kingdoms and queendoms, and what transpired when enslavement happened, and how we grew out of that, and how the resilience still exists. Those were things that were really highlighted in that portion. The fact that the Pan African Women's organization was formed the year before and kind of gave some impetus to the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, which is now the African Union, and how that works, and how women, because there were sisters on the that were sharing each and every opportunity possible. How do we have more of a connection between the Caribbean and Africa? More specifically, the Caribbean Americas and Africa, and how do they get involved in these things that CARICOM and CRC were able to show are actually working, are actually facilitating having stronger relationships with, and we had a series of dynamic presentations from youth on panels from the floor that were specifically speaking to, you have to include us at the planning. You have to include us from the beginning, so that we're not just the periphery as the youth, because we know that the youth are the spark of the revolution. And then the second to last point I need to highlight that came up was the fact that persons that were in the room actually were watching or looking at things that come from the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. So it's very interesting that persons have been watching the videos and been watching what's on YouTube and referencing that's helping them to understand the reparatory justice thrust, things that CPAD is producing, the global Africa people to people conferences and forums. People have been watching them and are going back and looking at them and are asking how they can be participatory. And they were very kind in sharing some of the information on prioritizing conversations around reparations, reparatory justice, repatriation, restitution. A lot of different things came up in those conversations. And then the connection to traditional institutions and being able to have that, again, have the connections with the African Union, connections with CARICOM, Reparations Commission, United Nations, Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, but delicately and most respectfully making sure that the civil society isn't like a pawn on the side that doesn't get to go across the board. Okay, I want chess, but doesn't get to really be engaged, but just gets to present, but isn't like in the formal thrust of the reparatory justice piece. So that was another piece that came up. So there were a number of organizations, inclusive, Caribbean Rastafari organization, which is inside of CPAN as well. So there were like commentaries about the role of Rastafari. There were commentaries about these diasporan organizations in the continent. There was a connection to the Coalition of National Youth Organizations in Ghana, which, while they were not involved in this particular conference, had they been more involved in other activities, then they have already committed their support of reparations activities moving forward in Ghana and with their networks throughout the African continent. I think that the connection to IDO International, also the Atakere International Development Organization, which focuses on how to have the traditional institutions, the traditional African kingdoms and queendoms integrated in these types of conversations. That's another piece that came up, because that's when we talked about, like, I'm very quick to speak of the movement that we've been in our organization, Parent Unc and Smita, and the UNIA ACL RC 2020 of African Women Lead. And I had to stop in the Q&A and make it clear that I was not saying African Women Lead in the context of a feminist, Europeanized form of separation, that I was saying African Women Lead because as nurturers, as cultivators, that work with our men, with our kings, with our brothers, that we're doing this work together to make sure that we can nurture our youth, our men, our families, our communities, our society, and ultimately our African civilization, which helps all of humanity. So there was a lot. And I mean, this conversation could go on for hours because it was a lot, and there were a number of organizations, persons that are speaking of Pan-African Congresses and making sure that the themes inside of these Pan-African Congresses moving into 2024 highlight and feature and really spend qualitative time pulling on this whole theme of reparatory justice and reparations, and utilizing what came out of these different conferences, as Ambassador Thomas Young mentioned, from things that are happening from CARICOM, things that are happening with the University of the West Indies, work that's being done, spearheaded by Dr. Hilary Beckles, work that's being spearheaded by Dr. Vereen Shepherd and others, right? The work that's happening inside of CPAN, the work that the ESCTT is doing, things that are happening with the Caribbean Rastafari Organization and other organizations, all of the reparations commissions inside of the CRC. Everybody's doing a lot of work. It's a tremendous amount of work. And this conference facilitated one thread of how we can actually have a synergy between all layers of our respective communities and societies they're in. And I'm sure that I left out some other pieces, because even the Nguzo Saba principles came up, because that was another.
I gotta congratulate you on doing a great job on helping our listeners to see the different levels. Because when Ambassador Commission speaks these days, he speaks at that governmental level. He's talking about cooperation at that level. So it's really important that you could bring your voice to shed some light on what's happening at the civil society level. And just to ask you the question, do you feel that the discourse there is a healthy one, and that real progress is being made at that level as well?
I think there's a lot of progress that's being made on that level. And the question becomes, my hashtag that everyone started to say, actionable deliverables. Like, we can have these convenings and 20 years from now have the exact same convening and, nice food, nice environment, etc. But just like what Ambassador Kamishang shared this evening, and as well at the actual conference, there were very clear benchmarks. This is what has been done. This is what we're doing next. This is what we're going to establish in 2024. This is what we're going to establish in 2025. So what was really powerful from this particular conference, for those that are willing to do the work and are willing to go beyond just the chatter, right? This gives us an opportunity to see how we do all of this networking throughout all these different building blocks of civilization.
I want to bring in my brother, Reverend Kwame Kamal, who's been silent tonight, unusually so. But before I even do Dr. Chenzio, let me just leave with one question before I bring Kwame in. I just want to, one of the things that our listeners, when you talk to the man on the street, I know Dr. Ambassador Commission and the chair of the Emancipation Support Committee, TT, and so on, who are always interacting with people from the continent, they have a real positive sense of that community that exists. But a lot of people, based on how we've been taught about Africa, basically we come with a certain degree of suspicion and concern. Just help me, for the sake of our listeners, just to tell us, what was that discourse like at the civil society level between those on the continent? Did you feel that there was a collective understanding, that you all were on the same page, the civil society from the Caribbean and civil society from the continent? Did you feel that there was a gap or distance between the two groups, or did you feel that there was something, that there was that communing taking place?
I felt that there was a lot of communing in many respects. However, there were several organizations, because again, I go to these sessions, but I also go into the street, because that's what a community organizer does. And so There were entities and organizations. I speak of persons like Dr. Maulana. I speak of Mama Lou, who came to the sessions, but again, made it very clear that many people on the ground in Ghana, many people in the civil society, they just weren't aware. And it's not so much that they weren't invited or not asked to be in a panel, but this was something that was built upon several other activities. So there were certain entities, like I mentioned, the Coalition of National Youth Organizations of Ghana. They didn't know. They found out from me. So, and that's a large circle of persons that are either in body politic as well as non-governmental organizations,
So in a sense,
Rastafari
then the
organizations.
continent is like the
Yeah.
Caribbean. We
So there's
still
more
have
to
some
do.
gaps between. I say the continent is then in a sense just like the Caribbean. We have some gaps here in
Yeah,
terms
and we're
of
working
bringing
on
all
it.
our people on board. Yeah, so let me bring Reverend Kamal. Reverend
With
Kamal,
positive still.
we are in Indaba overtime, and you are welcome to fire it up.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Once I passed the baton to you, it was in capable hands. I was waiting for you to pass it back at some point. Finally, you've gotten through the battery of questions that were welling up in your mind, and I'm glad that you did. They were brilliant questions. So you made my job exceedingly easy on tonight. And of course, we have fabulous guests on tonight, both in Ambassador David Commission and Dr. Chenzura. A couple questions that I would want to feel maybe a comment or two as we are in double overtime. One of the things that I specialize as an African reparations minister, is that of the whole business of internal reparations. It has been long said by Rastafari, by persons within, of course, the revolutionary movements throughout CARICOM and the African continent, that because we maintained democracy from a Westminster model framework, and because we maintained capitalism in whatever form that we rolled it out, in most instances, independence and the independence movement that happened in the Caribbean in the 1960s, same thing happened in the African continent, was really just a flag and an anthem being exchanged. And in many regards, we are very oppressive, suppressive societies towards our own indigenous people. They spoke about earlier on tonight the fact that Rastafari in Jamaica, Rastafari in Dominica, of course, it was a point that the Honorable Ambassador raised. In Trinidad and Tobago, under Randolph Burrows, many Rastafari were unalive. Extrajudicial killings took place en masse. In some regard, it still takes place. So you move the white veneer and the white face in terms of the colonial structure. But in many instances, because we continued based on certain religious trappings, based on certain political trappings, and certain economic trappings, in a very, very real way, the CARICOM and the African situation is considered by many to be in a deeply neo-colonialist state. Question coming out of that statement: what does internal reparations look like in terms of low-hanging fruit? And I know war crimes and genocide and ethnocide and culturecide and menticide, usually the bar is raised very high in terms of what we declare to be war crimes and crimes against humanity. But further to our independence, we have not always been so kind to our African populations, our indigenous populations. We have some low hanging fruit. We have governments that are in the charge and the care of African people, people that look like us, especially in the African majority nations in Africa and the CARICOM. What does a self repair,
Yeah.
internal repair look like in
I
that
think
context as we
just
try to move out of a
Reverend
neo-colonial state
Kamal, I think
into
just
another
to,
state?
just to bring your question home, I think what he's asking is what responsibility do we have now beyond and this is the kind of conversation we tend to have in Indaba over time. What responsibility do we have involved in this international reparation struggle to engage in the self repair or the to deal with, to pay attention to the legacy of colonialism that we are living with while we pursue reparations from those people responsible for these challenges that we face. What responsibility do we have now, and how are we looking at ways to address those legacy items that he describes as low hanging fruit at this time?
That's exactly why we were talking about these relationship building opportunities that we have between the Caribbean and Africa and the rest of the world, because it's going to be people to people engagement. It's going to be through doing specific work, specific psychological uplifting, elevation activities, things that actually heal our relationships, whether it's through educational exchange, through cultural heritage exchanges, through some, cultural tourism, which is, it's being done. We just have to elevate it to a place that actually integrates the public awareness around reparations and reparatory justice.
I hear you, Dr. Chichu. I wanna ask a specific question so we can, because this is what Indaba Overtime is about. There's fire. So let me get a specific question going here now. You have a situation where Fanon says it, the colonial state is a state of statues. And so, all the people who were involved in the conquest and the military and political violence are celebrated across a colonial space. We have been independent now for several decades. Is it part of the reparation struggle, for the benefit of our listeners, that we begin the process of ending the epistemic violence that this celebration of colonial villains in our public spaces represents? Because it is part of the process of mental colonization that they would want us to see their heroes, our antagonists, as our heroes as well. And so that's just a specific detail. Now, that's just one of many of the legacy items that we have around us. Is this going to be part of the reparations thrust as well, or the reparatory justice thrust as well? I mean, I know it's not part of the thrust to gain reparatory justice from our colonial, the imperialists, but in terms of the work that we have to do internally, as Kwame said, low-hanging fruit, is this part of the struggle that we will engage in?
That's part of the CARICOM reparations plan. Part of the CARICOM reparations plan is the taking down of public monuments that celebrate criminals who were involved in the oppression of our people. So that's already part of our plan. But we have to be very careful about this notion of us being damaged people. The reality is, our people were brought over the Atlantic. They were placed in locations of barbarism. They came with their African selves, their African personalities, the African worldview, the African spirituality. And we had to contend with the location of barbarism. We had to resist the oppression. We had to resist it physically, militarily, but we also resisted it culturally, with cultural creativity. And the people of the African people of the New World, of the Caribbean and the North American societies, we created something new. Out of the new environment, out of the resistance, we created something new. We add something new to Pan-African culture and civilization, whether you look at our music, our art, our nation languages, our proverbs, our spirituality, our religious practices, our culinary arts. I mean, you look at something like the steel band in Trinidad, the ultimate of African creativity, taking discarded oil drums and creating the world's youngest musical instrument. So we have to be very careful. All people who suffer trauma are marked by trauma. There are no people in this world that are not damaged in some way. Anybody who goes through trauma is damaged. But we also have to be conscious of what we have created right? What our struggle over these past 400-500 years in this part of the world, what that has generated. So yes, there are things that we lost in terms of our continental African heritage that it would profit us if we could regain some of that knowledge. And that is part of the CARICOM reparations plan, that African cultural reconnections. But there are also things that we created, new things that we created.
I think the emphasis, Ambassador Commission here in Kwame's question is on the institutional legacy of colonialism, which remains. Some of our societies are still institutionally racist in certain ways, and even though we have Africans who sit at the highest levels and who achieve, there are still stumbling blocks for those who come from certain marginalized sectors. In some countries, it's those who are of darker skin. In some countries, it's those who represent, who choose an African form of culture or religion that is outside the mainstream. We still have institutional discrimination in our societies. And is that something that we should continue to seek to address?
Yes, but let us have a sophisticated understanding of our condition. So, for example, the Barbados established a House of Assembly in 1639. That House of Assembly was an instrument of racism, of oppression, of dehumanization, and it existed in that format perhaps well into the 20th century. But our people humanized that instrument of oppression. Our people took that House of Assembly and transformed its quality into a mechanism to nurture, to develop, to lift up people. So many of the formal structures that were colonial structures that we inherited, Black people transformed them. We humanize these locations of barbarism. Yes, they are not perfect. There are deficiencies within them, but we also have to look at the big picture, where we came from, what we did with these instruments of dehumanization and oppression, and what the kind of societies that we have created. Yes, there's still elements of neocolonialism. The reality is, we live in the shadow of the hegemon. We live in the shadow of very powerful imperialist countries, and that impacts upon us. We have to find creative ways of resisting the hegemon. Sometimes it's not possible to just outright, boldly and frontally resist. Sometimes you have to find creative ways of still holding on to your principles, and resisting in a creative way. So we are still a project in process. Yes, there are deficiencies, but I urge us not to be overly harsh and condemnatory on ourselves, because when we look at the bigger picture, when we look at the journey that we have traveled, where we came from, the deep oppressive hole that we had to claw ourselves out of, and how we had to transform these locations of evil and barbarism into meaningful, nurturing human societies. Let us be conscious of our achievement as well, even as we go about correcting deficiencies that exist, and repairing and perfecting ourselves. That would be my way of approaching it. I would also like to say before we end that I put 2 recommendations on the table at the Accra conference. One recommendation is that every African and Caribbean country should celebrate Emancipation Day on the 1st of August, should make reparations the center of that celebration. The second recommendation was we should produce a standard textbook that deals with the story of the transatlantic slave, what Africa was before, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, the whole process of African enslavement, the resistance state, the abolition of slavery, and reparations. And that textbook should be in every single African and Caribbean school, so that there's one standard text that all of our African children are exposed to during their secondary school career. Now, I don't know yet whether those recommendations were embraced by the conference, because we are still awaiting the production of the Accra Proclamation, which will be the official outcomes document of the conference. But if they are not in the Accra Proclamation, these are two recommendations that we are going to try to take forward in the Caribbean.
Well, Ambassador Commission, we know you as a visionary, and we always look forward to the kinds of proposals that you put forward to move us forward as a people, as a region, as a global community. So we thank you for that, and of course we support and salute those recommendations. Dr. Chinzira, your closing remarks. We're on the edge of time here now. We'd like to have you.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful. I want to first and foremost just give thanks to Indaba for having this platform available to have this type of a conversation. And I want to come back to what I said in the very beginning, that there's a lot of reconnection that's taking place. So this particular conference, the ARC, people call it the ARC 2023, allows for a number of other things to be built upon so that we can actually move the reparations conversation into actionable deliverables with specific activities happening on both sides of the Atlantic. I think it's really critical that persons also are aware, and it's kind of lending itself. CPAN has been able to do these global Africa people-to-people initiatives, conferences, seminars, webinars, exchanges, and it's facilitating a number of other groups within the Caribbean and Africa and the Americas to be engaged. And I just didn't want it to seem like this was only a CARICOM African continent piece, because there were persons from all over, Africans that came from the EU, brothers and sisters that came from the 48 contiguous US, as well as Canada. So, and persons representing the Pacific Isles, persons representing Africans' presence in Asia, contemporary time. And I think it's really critical to know that. Next week, however, from the 29th to the 4th, the Bonaire Human Rights Organization is going to be hosting its 8th symposium on contemporary colonialism and reparations in the Caribbean. And the whole idea is reuniting the colonies of the former Antilles, Caribbean, and Americas in solidarity for a better future of our people. I encourage persons to just keep an eye out. We're going to have those links available, because while it's live in Bonaire, they're going to be doing live stream and pulling in all of this information that's coming from CPAN that they've asked to provide some support in regards to content for them. There's going to be a panel.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be happy to share those links through the ESCTT and to make a follow-up announcement next week, Wednesday, on Indaba. But I think what has come out of today's program is a sense of optimism about the future of the struggle. And there's oftentimes we have this program here, we deal with so many negatives. There's a sense of pessimism when it's finished. But today, I think we can all agree that we can leave tonight's Indaba, this subject of reparations, with a sense of optimism. Is everybody with me there, Brother Kamau? You with me on that?
I'm with you 1,000%. As a matter of fact, I would like to especially thank Ambassador David Commission, not only for the sterling work in terms of being part of the thought leadership going into Accra 2023, but certainly the decades of service. You make it look easy, Ambassador Commission. As a matter of fact, I don't know, what do you have for breakfast? But you are getting better with age, and so you don't look it at all. You certainly look as if you are part of the generation of Shabaka, Cambon, and I. And so something is wrong with the maths. The maths ain't mathsing in terms of that process. So we are glad to have you in the sense that you are a thought leader and you have been committed to this over a number of years, both at the civil society level and now at the government level, regionally, and now even internationally, playing such a pivotal and important role. We are also happy to see that we have our amazing, I call her my supreme queen mother, for a number of reasons, bringing the fire, representing, Africana womanism at its alpine heights and endeavor best, representing, not only the contemporary, but also the historic, not only the secular, but also the spiritual, in such a really wonderfully integrated way. So when we have thought leaders like yourselves representing us, listen, I wish I could have been in your suitcase there in Accra. But for all intents and purposes, we had really powerful representation. We are looking forward to next steps for sure. And so I had a number of questions, but there is a revolving invitation for both of you on Indaba. We have to delve into questions like, what is the role of affirmative action, if any, within the 10-point reparatory justice plan of CRC within our regions? We have to look at a number of other things as it relates to indigenous rights and other rights.
Extend,
it's
time for that. But I think we've come to the end of our program for tonight. I as well want to thank our guests, and on that note of the youthful appearance of our dear ambassador, I have to say he was in Durban in 2001, and all the people who were in Durban in 2001 are great. The man is fully black, so something you're right, Kwame. Something is a little strange here. But guys, thank you very much for being with us tonight on Indaba. Lots of love to you and your communities back home.
Thank you very much, and it was such a pleasure to have Elder Kafra Cambon with us in Accra.
And Mama, Dr. Asha, yes.
We have our respected elder with us, and he's always a strong moral force and a historical point of reference for us all.
Thank you very much. I'm sure he is listening and would have been happy to hear that. Good night to you all. Best wishes.
Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago invites you to the 2023 ESCTT Kwanzaa Market at the Queen's Park Savannah on Friday 1st to 3rd December from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Come enjoy music, food and drinks, samples while you shop for local delicacies, home decor, skincare items, clothing, jewelry, and unique gift items. If you missed shopping at the Emancipation Village this year, here is your chance to get those special niche products. Come to the Kwanzaa Market Friday 1st to 3rd December. For more information, call 292-7288 or 235-5008.